our esteemed guest, who embodies the spirit of innovation and entrepreneurialism that defines our series. So, Robbie Allen is the co-founder and CEO of Bionic Health, a preventative care company that optimizes your health span through personalized medicine delivered by expert physicians. He's also a general partner at the Tweener Fund, an early stage venture capital firm that invests in triangle technology and startups. And then to his left is James Kotecki, is that correct? He's a content producer who helps tech brands tell their stories. He is the host of CES Tech Talk, which Chartable ranked as a top US and global tech podcast, and the C-Space Studio, an interview series that drove over 58,000 engagements from CES in 2024. So, without further ado, you guys.
Hey.
Hey.
Hi, everyone.
Howdy.
Audio good?
Yep.
How about mine?
That works? Yep.
All right, so we should contextualize. People should know that we know each other. That's probably the first thing that should happen.
Yeah, so James, and we'll get into our backgrounds, but James joined my first startup pretty early on, and we've worked together at a later startup. So we've worked together for many years. And so when I was asked about coming to give a talk, I thought, who better to interview me than somebody I've worked with in the past and knows a lot about the story and has gone through and been in the trenches with me for a couple of different startups.
And let's see if he immediately regrets that decision. Robbie, I think we got to start with the backstory. People talk about the bionic journey, but what's the Robbie Allen journey? Let's maybe should we start around Cisco era, I think?
Yeah, so I went to a few different colleges for my undergrad, but I was in computer science, and I'm one of the lucky few that in 10th grade I took what was called a business machines class, the one computer class in my high school, and I instantly knew that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And so 10th grade on, I was lucky enough to know that I wanted to do something related to computers, and so I went into computer science. I started doing internships in college, and the second one I did was with Cisco in RTP. And that went well. This was 1997, to date myself a little bit. And at the end of the internship, they told me that this thing called the dot-com boom was happening in Silicon Valley, and they didn't care that I didn't have my degree yet. I was still a junior in college. They needed programmers as fast as they could find them, and they would be happy to shift me off to San Jose, California. So being a 19, 20-year-old, I thought, wow, that sounds great, because to me, the whole point of going to college was to get a good job, and if I could get a good job without having finished my degree, that was fine with me. They said, I can finish my degree in my spare time, and so I thought, oh, I'll just do that. So I moved out to California, and by the way, I'm from, grew up, or born in Burlington, North Carolina. Then we lived in Winston-Salem, North Carolina for a lot of my kind of early childhood. Then moved out to Oklahoma. My dad worked for AT&T, and so we got transferred around a lot. So anyway, I've always called North Carolina home, even though I lived in California for a while. Anyway, I was out there and enjoyed it, and kind of my first big career goal was to become a distinguished engineer at Cisco. This was, there's a handful of engineers. I think at the time the company was maybe 70,000 employees, and there were 50 of these distinguished engineers in the company. These were the top technical position in the company. For Cisco, which is a networking company, most of the distinguished engineers were people that had written the protocols behind the internet. So like the foundations that the internet was built on were developed by these distinguished engineers at Cisco. So when I joined the company in 1997, I thought, wow, that's the goal. I want to become a distinguished engineer. So I decided to put all my effort into being the best engineer I possibly could. Moved out to California, was doing 80-hour weeks fairly consistently, slept under my desk 2 to 3 nights a week. And the sort of math that I would do is I lived in South San Jose, which was about a 45-minute commute. And I thought, well, I could either, I'd stop working at like 8 p.m., drive an hour, go to bed, get up, drive another hour, or if I just slept under my desk, I could save all that time, and like, how much more work could I get done, you know? So Cisco, I always felt got their money's worth out of me. But anyway, fast forward, I started writing technical books. I ended up writing 10 technical books in a 5-year period on a bunch of different programming topics and other things. And then I went to get my master's degree. I went to MIT and got 2 master's degrees in 2 years. And then coming out of that, Cisco said, Robbie, congratulations, we want to make you a distinguished engineer. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. It took me 10 years to do this. They said, first time ever somebody's gone from intern to distinguished engineer. And I was like, great. And I was super excited. And I said, all right, now what? We're going to throw a party. What are we going to do? And they said, well, just come into work tomorrow. And I was like, oh, but like, I mean, does this mean I get new responsibilities or like what's going? No, just keep doing what you're doing. And that was like one of my first big career lessons, because then I kind of was like, took a little bit of the wind out of my sails, because, I'd spent 10 years working toward this goal that took a bunch of time and energy. And really it wasn't, once I achieved that goal, it was kind of unfulfilling ultimately. When in retrospect, really what the fulfilling part was the journey. And I guess that'll be our theme is journeys.
Very nice.
And so that journey, that 10 years I spent where I learned so much and I met so many people and I did all these things, that was the fun part. And that actual long-term goal wasn't all that meaningful to me. And so that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. And so once that happened, I was like, well, I don't know if I'm going to stay at Cisco for the rest of my life. In fact, I think maybe I could go off and do something on my own. And so again, I was in Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom and bust. So I saw lots of startups being created, and a lot of them didn't make it. But along the way, again, I come from, and the reason why I mentioned it, from Burlington. My dad worked at AT&T. My mom worked at Haynes Hosiery in Winston-Salem. So both in manufacturing sort of lines of business. I don't think I heard the word entrepreneur until I was in college, or at least that's what I like to say. And so I didn't think that was an option for me. I thought being a business owner was something that rich people did, right? Like I didn't think that was something that just anybody could go do. So it took me a long time to figure out that I could go start a company. It took me being, in one of the biggest startup creation eras of our lifetimes, the dot-com boom back in the late 90s and early 2000s, for me to say, actually, I guess I could do this. I see regular people starting companies. And so when I went to MIT, while I was working at Cisco, I went because, again, I'm an engineer. I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll go take the class on how to be an entrepreneur, because that's what you do, right? You go take the class. And knowing that it doesn't actually work exactly like that. Entrepreneurism is best learned by doing. It's not something you can easily just read in a textbook and just rock. You just do it. And so anyway, but that's what I did. I went to MIT, and obviously I enjoyed that. Again, being a computer science person, MIT is sort of a mecca for computer scientists. So I liked all of that, but I didn't really learn how to be an entrepreneur. And so when I came out, I was like, all right, I guess I just need to go start something. And that kind of gets me to the very first company that I started.
Well, great. Okay, for the next 10 to 15 minute chunk, I'm gonna. I appreciate the chance to ask this question, which is, when you looked around at Cisco, were there other people who felt this way? Or did you feel unique in the way that you were feeling? Both that entrepreneurialism was kind of drawing you, but also that maybe that kind of lifestyle of what you were doing at Cisco wasn't ultimately fulfilling?
So it's not something I necessarily talked about. I mean, generally you didn't go around talking about how unfulfilled you were in your job, especially distinguished engineers. They were held to this high pedestal, and like everybody wanted to be that. So how could you possibly have that position and then not be happy about it, right? So it's not like something I went around and talked about. But the funny thing is, like all these years later, there are a couple of other entrepreneurs that I worked with all those years back that are now doing big startups, and they've raised lots of money and they've gone on to be very successful. And it's just funny, because it takes time, right? It's also not something that, I'm sure when I told my boss that I was leaving to start a company, he's like, okay, good luck with that. We'll see you in a couple years. It's not something that you can necessarily predict how successful you'll be at it. And so it wasn't something that, going into it, it was clear that this was going to be the long-term path for me.
And so you started the first company, which of course was StatSheet, that became Automated Insights. And we can talk a little bit about what that was to contextualize it for people, but also can you contextualize for us, how much of a plan did you have when you started StatSheet, which I know you started on the side at Cisco? Did you think, oh, I'll start this on the side and then I'm definitely going to spin this out and launch this and do my own thing? Or was it more experimental, tepid, I don't know if this is going to work, let me just try this? Where was your attitude there?
So one of the challenges with the position that I had gotten to at Cisco is the bar was pretty high for me to leave, right? You know, I can convince my wife of a lot of things, but like leaving this job that I'd worked all these years for to go do something where I'm making next to no money and there's no prospects that I'll be successful at, it wasn't exactly a very attractive proposition. And so what I did was I started something, you know, I finished up at MIT, I came back and I started a company while working at Cisco. And the other kind of, you know, the next interesting aspect of the journey was, well, what am I going to start a company on? You know, I kind of had this idea I want to start a company, but you need something to start a company around. Well, you know, back in the early 2000s, which is when I was at MIT, you know, it was becoming sort of popularized around follow your passion, right? You might often hear that, you know, follow your passions. If you can follow your passions, then it's not like you're even working, right? Because you just enjoy doing it so much. And that really resonated with me because like anytime I could be passionate about something, you know, I'd put in all the time and effort necessary to be successful at it. The problem with that advice is by definition, you know, A, you're not passionate about very many things, and B, those things that you're passionate about, how many of those are great business opportunities, right? I have 2 kids, I'm passionate about them and you know, playing with them and, you know, spending time with them, but they're not exactly, you know, great business opportunities. And so, you know, so that advice fell a little flat. But what I did was I made a list, like what are the things that I enjoy doing the most? And now the advice that I follow more is follow your talent. You know, don't follow your passion, follow your talent, because again, passion doesn't necessarily equate to business per se. And it doesn't always translate so well. What a better advice is to follow something that you're good at doing, because generally if you're good at doing it, you can actually develop a passion out of it. And so what I did was I made a list of the things I was, quote, passionate about. It was 3 things. It was web programming, and this was mid-2000s. Internet was still relatively immature. I mean, there's still not a lot, you know, of even sort of the modern day applications and websites you go to today. They were very immature back then, if they even existed. Doing interesting things with data. So I'm a bit of a data geek. You know, I've always, you know, enjoyed doing things with data. And then the third thing was UNC basketball. And so that was my list. You know, kind of side story, I have to get this out. I started the first blog, this fun fact, started the first blog dedicated to UNC basketball in 2002. The first, meaning the first of all time. Like no one had had a blog yet. In 2002, dedicated to UNC basketball, and I did it. And it was mostly, again, because I was an internet geek and I watched every UNC basketball game. And then what I would do is write a recap after every game. Uh-oh.
What a recap.
Yeah. Does that mean something we're supposed to? But so I'd write recaps after every game. And so this is relevant in a minute. So I did this for several years. And eventually I'm like, you know what? These recaps are pretty formulaic. Right? Like really at the end of the day, when you're writing a summary of a sporting event, what you're kind of doing is summarizing the statistics of the game, right? So somebody scores 20 points. Well, guess what? And that was the high score of the game. You tend to talk about that scorer. And so, you know, there's kind of these predictable things that I started to see in my writing of these recaps. It's like, well, I'm talking, you know, if somebody had a career game, then you mentioned that, you know, if the team played below average, you know, below their typical performance, you mentioned that. So anyway, when I started thinking about this next thing what could I start? I thought sports statistics could be an interesting, you know, Venn diagram. If you look at the Venn diagram of data, web, UNC basketball, what you might come up with is a sports statistics website.
And where were we in like the Moneyball era of that being known?
So Moneyball came out in 2002 or 3, I think.
Yeah.
And then I started StatSheet in 2007.
Yeah.
But while I was at MIT, they held some of the first sports analytics conferences. And so MIT is known for this, the preeminent sports analytics conference. And that started, I think, in 2005. I went to the very first one. And so coming out of that, I started this website that was just all about stats in college basketball. And I figured, you know, if I can get this to be successful enough working nights and weekends, I could add other sports, football, you know, racing, baseball, you know, all sorts of sports, and that's how I could grow this venture into be something successful. But that was, you know, mostly while I worked at Cisco.
And so then what gave you the push to leave?
So, I worked on it for 2.5 years, and after a couple of years, I was like, I still like working on this thing. That's not changing, and, you know, I'm not liking working at Cisco anymore. It's probably best for everybody that I just stop working at Cisco and do this full time. And so that's essentially was the decision point in 2010. I was like, all right, it's time. I need to make the transition. And just, even though it still wasn't like a sure thing, obviously I'd been working on it a couple years, but I decided then I'm ready to make the jump. I'm going to leave this cushy job that virtually no one would want to leave if they were in my position, but I was ready to go put my hat in to try to be an entrepreneur.
Chris Ively, who's a local entrepreneurial guru, I guess I could say, I believe it was his newsletter recently where I read a quote like, if you're making a pro-con list and like looking at the exact kind of economics or trying to run the numbers on if you're ready to leave and go do your own thing, then that means you're not ready to leave and go do your own thing. There's a certain element of it's just an emotion, right? I mean, you're supposed to be this data-driven entrepreneur, and everybody is, but you're especially, you're all about statistics and data. But ultimately, it just comes down to a feeling, like just this itch, like I think it's time to go. And you hope that you have the support from your family to do that.
Yeah, I mean, look at me. I was actually fairly risk adverse. I mean, it took me, I started going, I attended MIT in 2004. It still took me 6 years after that to officially start my company, right? And so, even though I'm very sort of analytical and tried to take a course on entrepreneurship, it took that amount of time for me to finally come around and say, all right, I got to do this thing. Other people, they kind of, again, that's part of my upbringing too. Some people are born with it. We can get into like how I talk about entrepreneurship with my kids. It's totally different than what I came up with. But yeah, it's certainly, you're never going to have a pro-con list where the pros outweigh the cons in most cases for starting a company, because generally it's not necessarily the most sane strategy if you're wanting to maximize like near-term return on investment, near-term, making income, things like that.
So then how did you start, because then you were working on this full-time but by yourself for a while. So then how did people, because when I joined the company there were 30, 40 people there. So how did people start coming into the orbit, or this is another big entrepreneurial pivot point I think, is to make the decision to actually hire someone to join this thing. It's not just you who has to believe in it now, you have to convince somebody else who isn't your family. Talk to us about that step.
Yeah, that was actually really easy because I developed all the code by myself for 2 or 3 years. At that point, I was ready to have other people come work on it, right? I'd seen the limitations and how far I could do it by myself. And so, I immediately hired 5 people, right? So as soon as I raised some money and I left Cisco, I hired five people. And
maybe we should talk about raising money then, because that's not necessarily a given either. And it ebbs and flows about how easy it is to do that. But how did you do that for the first time? Because now you're a serial entrepreneur, but it's interesting to hear about the first time for all these things.
Yeah, and it is totally sort of time dependent. And so like I initially was trying to raise in 2009, which is right after the financial crisis. And so that was challenging because the VC market dried up, and it wasn't necessarily an easy thing. I just happened to get lucky and I found a VC that was a big sports enthusiast. He was a Duke alumni, and so him and I could have some friendly banter because I was a UNC guy, he's a Duke guy, and he just kind of, just as irrational as entrepreneurship is when it comes to like taking the plunge, it's also that way on the VC side, the investor side. Like, they can give you reasons all day long as to why they should or shouldn't invest in your company. Ultimately, it's kind of comes down to a feeling that they get. There's not, especially at the early stage, there's just not the numbers to prove whether or not you're a good investment. It's really about, do they believe in you and can you convince them to make a leap with you? And so again, I just happened to get lucky with this one VC that was willing to write a big check and willing to do that leap.